Morning to those who have joined us. We are nearly ready to get started. We'll give the stragglers 30 seconds or so to join in, get their audio connected, etc., and we will kickstart. Okay, and I think we're good to go. So thanks very much for joining us this morning, everyone, to have a bit of a deep dive session into the world of privilege access management and all that entails. We're going to be talking about one topic around privilege specifically this morning, which I will go on to in a bit more detail shortly. Before I do, the usual housekeeping slide. So it is an interactive webinar. I know Zoom doesn't always do it automatically, but if you could keep yourself on mute throughout, but do by all means use the chat box to submit any questions. We will address them all. We've actually got a section towards the end of the session dedicated to Q&A, so we will absolutely pick up all your questions as we go. Do use the chat box to do so. The session is being recorded as well. This will be sent out to you all tomorrow morning once we wrap things up. And of course, if you would like to discuss today's topic in any more detail with myself or one of the team, there will be a question at the end of the session in order for you to submit your interest in that as well. Now let's get started. By way of brief introduction for myself, my name's Toby Noble. I'm a security business manager here at Bytes. I look after the identity proposition here. So I've worked with our colleagues from CyberArk who join us today for a number of years now, and frequently have PAM and other identity conversations with our customers, helping them to formulate a sort of structure and plan in this space to help address some of the challenges, some of which we're going to go into in a bit more detail today. So as I promised, we are looking to delve into one specific area of PAM today. PAM is quite a broad subject in itself. So really what the focus of today's session is going to be around is what we call endpoint privilege management, which is to say that idea of least privilege, restricting privilege across your entire estate, not just for your typically privileged, usually IT admin users, but really we're looking at that concept of privilege sprawl. How does privilege get across your estate and sometimes go unnoticed across those more typical users? So I'm joined by two people today. I've got David and Aeron, both from CyberArk. So I'm going to hand over to David in just a moment to set a bit of the context, give us a bit of pretext to the situation we're looking to explore today around privilege, what that means from the attacker's perspective, but also our side of the fence. How can we leverage best practice in this space to best defend our estates? And then we're going to dive straight into a real-time live demo, which Aeron is going to lead. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over to David.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the introduction. And I am going to kick off with screen sharing and just open with a couple of slides to just set a bit more context, exactly as Toby outlined, and then really get into the meat of it and do that deep dive into sorry, bear with me, into the actual capability, right? So bear with me, let me try this again. All right, so hopefully, and maybe Toby, if you can just let me know that you can see a blue screen.
We can indeed, yes.
Perfect, all right, and that now should be a lovely slide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant, all right. So as mentioned, just going to do a little bit of scene setting here and to give you some context into some of those points that Toby was mentioning. As he outlined, right, privileged access management is a pretty broad topic these days, covers a lot of different use cases, from administrators getting into your infrastructure, third-party users and remote vendors wanting access to services and applications that they, of course, are supporting for you, hard-coded credentials and secrets management, But there's also an area, and it got a lot of attention in the last couple of years for reasons we're going to outline, which is the privileges and entitlements we actually give on the endpoint, and more specifically onto the workstation. And this kind of makes PAM broader than the typical focus, as mentioned, right? A lot of the focus may sometimes be typically around the infrastructure and database type support staff, your IT community. In this conversation, though, we kind of broaden it a little bit further and actually say, well, actually, every individual workstation in your environment has a privilege discussion to be had about it. And I'm going to talk as to what I mean there, right? So first of which is the objective that we kind of want to give you as you walk away from this session, which is that we really got to try, and this is also, you know, a much broader overall objective of PAM, but ultimately we need to unprivilege the attacker. And there's different things that we can do around that, right? From appropriate hygiene around credentials, like credential management and vaulting, as you'll know with PAM, you know, but also, and really, you know, controlling when that access can happen through approval processes, session brokering, and all that fun stuff. But where we're going to focus today is around this topic on the right-hand side of, well, at least, oops, sorry, I'm clicking ahead. That's what happens when you've got one of those wheels on your mouse and it really got ahead of itself. We're going to focus here. And as I say, in the context of the endpoint of the workstation and the importance of enforcing least privilege. And as a consequence, when you do that, what we can then do from an application control perspective, because if we remove admin rights, well, then users can no longer do all the things that they said they needed to do, run certain applications, perform certain tasks. That's why they're in the administrator group to start with. A lot of customers that we speak to, when we start talking about least privilege and removing admin rights from the workstation, usually say, well, we're doing that already. But then there's a caveat. Well, we're doing it for most of our employees, but the developers, the IT admins, the execs, this team, that team, well, actually, we've got an exception to policy. They're either in the local administrators group, or, you know, there are certain use cases where we have to give them the local admin password, et cetera, et cetera. There are situations where actually we can't fully remove the admin rights because then the users can't do what they say they need to do on the workstation. And this can kind of create a challenge. And I'll put some context into that statement because I think we often presume when that initial beachhead's made by an attacker that they start in a kind of low privileged position. Maybe they've compromised, you know, an employee's credentials, or they've managed to get themselves onto a workstation. There's perhaps sometimes an assumption that they're operating not with full administrative rights, but with, you know, a bare minimal piece of entitlements that they kind of clawed together as they've made their ingress into the environment. But I want to draw your attention to that quote at the bottom right from the congressional hearing on the back of, the Senate's hearings on the back of the SolarWinds incident. And I'm paraphrasing, but ultimately the question is why were the attackers not detected? Right? They, you know, they got in, they did what they did to the SolarWinds environment, of course, pushed those malicious code updates out into the victims, and obviously there were thousands of those. And the question was, well, why were they not detected? And the paraphrasing answer I'm going to give you is, well, they actually ascertained full admin rights. And once you get into that position of having full administrative rights, you can do pretty much whatever you want. You can circumvent controls, you can disable monitoring and backups, et cetera, et cetera. It has always been a coveted position for an attacker to get to that highly elevated full administrative position because of what it allows them to do, whether that's deploying malicious malware or whether, as I say, that's disabling X, Y, or Z from a controls perspective. And what I want to do is, in the next couple of slides, give you a couple of examples where we see attackers circumventing security controls and specifically around authentication and credentials. The first of which they do need privilege, and actually secondly of the which they don't. But I pointed towards on the previous slide about that combination of least privilege and application control. I want to kind of demonstrate in the next few slides why that's really important. And Aeron's going to do the tricky job, the dangerous job of doing a live demonstration of both that capability. So the first, I want to kind of demonstrate the importance of least privilege, that if a user clicks on something, they open the wrong attachment, and if they're running with admin rights, well, then that gives the attacker the head start. So if we remove that, we can actually put ourselves in a pretty strong position. And I've got an example here of ransomware, not necessarily the obvious example you'd think about privileged access management and ransomware. Typically, discussions go in a different direction within security when the topic of ransomware comes up. But I want to highlight, this particular flow. It's based on the Dharma variant of ransomware. It's pretty reflective of a lot of the different flavors out there. But there's always that initial delivery. In this case, it's saying IDP compromise. And we can see a reference that actually in those attempts to deploy the initial payload, they'll look for external facing servers with admin accounts, which have got default credentials, etc. Of course, that initial payload could be delivered in other ways, right? Social engineering, phishing attacks, etc. So that delivery mechanism will vary for sure. But you see there the reference of admin access, because if they're able to execute that initial payload with administrative rights, well, then they can go about their evasive action. You can see straight away there, right? In this particular variant, one of the first steps is to disable endpoint security and monitoring, because if you've got administrative rights, well, ultimately you can do those kinds of things. What it then went on to do after that is credential harvesting. And a lot of credential harvesting, not all, also massively benefits from being run as a local administrator. If you're familiar with tools like Mimikatz as an example, which is a credential harvesting tool, very powerful in the Windows environment. It can extract hashes and then execute things like pass the hash attack, if you're familiar with that. It benefits from being run with admin rights. Some of the actions it needs administrative rights to do that. So you see there, there's either a requirement to escalate privileges, if not already achieved, and straight away move into that lateral movement phase, because with the administrative rights, they can start harvesting credentials and things like the LSAS process. And they actually, in the context of ransomware, this is a really logical element, right? Because ransomware is not just a point attack, right? It's not onto one workstation and leave it and walk away, right? If you've got one workstation that's out of action, it's annoying, but you can probably live with it. It wants to propagate, it wants to spread, it wants to impact as many different devices as it possibly can. And this is where the credential harvesting facilitated by administrative rights comes into play. And there's another aspect here to consider is that credential harvesting, it's, that initial payload, it's that malware, that unapproved process accessing some of these credential stores like the LSAS process, which facilitates this in terms of happening. So this for me is a really key point. I'm going to play out the rest of the scenario just so you can kind of, get a grip of what's going on here. But this is the really key point to kind of bear in mind. Then after that, it further goes on and actually creates more damage by disabling backups, because of course a good cyber hygiene posture against ransomware, of course, is to have good backups. So if they are nil and void, well, then you're more likely to pay the ransom. And it's only then at this point, at the very end, and actually we see the ransomware itself actually being executed, deliver as an exe in this case. So there's a lot of pre-work that happens in the attack process around ascertaining full administrative rights to then facilitate credential harvesting and lateral movement and the further deployment of that malware before, at the very end, that's when the more familiar area that we are with ransomware executes, right? The actual locking out of data being encrypted in this case, and then of course, the victim being held for ransom in that situation. So a lot of what you've seen here, the attackers are benefiting in seeking out, as you can see that escalation of privilege. So I use ransomware as an example, right? And you can probably see here, right? You could probably take the word ransomware out, and you could take data encrypted and ransomware execution out, and perhaps put data breach at the end of it, right? Very similar types of approach. And actually some of the more recent variants of ransomware that we see are also doing that. They're actually hitting victims with a double ransom, one for unlocking their workstations, and the other, what they've also been doing in the background, is performing lateral movement, getting to critical data stores, stealing data, taking it offline, and then they're holding the victim to a second ransom to say, well, look, if you want to prevent your data from being leaked, we've got a copy, you need to pay as a second ransom, right? And then you pay for the right to ultimately go on and log on to the attacker servers and delete your data, right? So the kind of, what happens in a data breach from lateral movement privilege escalation, very similar, right, actually, with ransomware these days as well. So I give that as an example, but I think you can put it into many different situations. Now I want to move on to a different scenario, and actually I'll use this threat research blog that our Cyber Labs team did as context for this discussion. but want to highlight the importance of combining a least privilege approach, right? So removing admin rights with credential protection, because not all credential harvesting requires admin level rights. So it needs to be a combined approach. So the guys did some research here on the Oski Stela, Oski's being a Nordic word, which is why you see a picture of a Viking there. If you wondered why there's the man with a Viking helmet and axe, that's the reason it's a Nordic word. But what this would go out and do is actually proactively go and steal login credentials via cookies. It would do it for crypto wallets, etc., and anything that you'd stored in autofill locations and browser locations. Relatively easy places actually for attackers to go and steal. And if you think about authentication and what happens typically, right, in say something like multi-factor authentication, you've got the initial identity of the user being provided. They identify themselves, username might be a full email address, etc. And then they go through the multiple stage and multiple factors of authentication that they need to provide, right? Ideally multi-factor, right? So it could be, you know, something they know, something they have, something they are, etc. You're probably all familiar with the factors. And then once that authentication is done, the user's usually given some form of authorization token, which they can then take to the source, right, the resource they want to access that proves they've gone through the authentication process, and now that identity should have the relevant authorizations into that resource. And often those authorization tokens are stored in the forms of cookies, as an example, right, which allow themselves to actually be exploited and targeted. You know, that is also a common route that we see attackers taking. If you can steal those authorization tokens, easy for me to say, then actually you kind of bypass that MFA to an extent. The user's gone through it, they've got their authorization token, and then actually the attacker takes that and leverages that to actually impersonate and exploit that individual's identity and not necessarily have to go through those controls of multi-factor authentication, etc. So a couple of excerpts that I've taken from the article. You see the link there. So if you're interested, it's definitely worth a read. It gets very technical. So if you're technically minded, there's a lot of tech detail in there in terms of how this particular malware variant works. But it's a particular variant that I share because its kind of primary goal is credential harvesting, right, and credential theft. And that is something that we can actually proactively defend against, right? So least privilege is a huge kind of step forward in terms of reducing the risk posture on your endpoints and making sure wrong links clicked, wrong attachments opened or being executed with minimal rights if they're not properly controlled. And really reduces the blast radius, you know, if there is that initial compromise. But in certain situations, it's not always a given. So we have to combine that as well with credential theft protection to stop, you know, attackers going to known locations, harvesting cookies, etc. And there's ways and means that we can do that, right? So we have on the next slide, the obvious malicious looking attacker there, looking very scary with the red eyes. But they're going to these credential caches, right, in order to perform that harvesting, whether it be LSAS, as I mentioned before, those browser-based locations. You know, every time you're in Chrome or you're in Edge and you're entering your credentials, it says, oh, do you want to save these for later, right? That kind of stuff gets put into, you know, a cache for the browser. Very easy actually for an attacker to exploit and target those. And we'll show ways and means that we can protect those in this kind of mindset here, which is, well, actually, what we look to do is make sure that combination of least privilege, once you've got that in place, you've got that great stepping stone in place that actually no one's running with admin rights, you can then combine that with ensuring that only approved and relevant applications can actually gain access to those credential stores. So it makes credential harvesting for the likes of Oski, as you saw before, very difficult because actually it's only those relevantly approved applications and processes that are able to access those caches. You see a reference there to credential lures. I'll cover that on the next slide. But it's often not a topic talked about too much. But of course, if those authorization tokens are compromised, that actually allows to bypass a lot of authentication processes that may perhaps exist. So what we're going to talk about and what we're going to show in the demo is this two-pronged attack, right? Enforcing least privilege at the endpoint and the importance of doing that. And as soon as you do that, right, you have to then start looking at application control and just-in-time elevation, because you take admin access away from your executives. They'll say, well, hang on a second, I can't install all the weird apps I wanted to run when I was at home, right? Or you take it away from the developers, they'll definitely complain that, you know, their development tools no longer run and they needed admin rights to execute it, right? So by enforcing least privilege, we then have to, you know, enable users to run things, perform certain actions which historically meant they were sitting in admin groups or sitting with admin rights, but actually do that through an on-demand elevation, right? Just-in-time elevation, right? You can run that app, and we're going to run it with the relevant permissions it needs, but you as a user, you sit as a box standard user, right? So we reduce that risk, we reduce that likelihood of an attacker getting that head start in the environment by ascertaining high privileged access rights, which, as we saw from the ransomware variant, is a common target and has far-reaching repercussions. But what we also need to do is combine that with proactive defense on the credential side. So putting in those checkpoints, those controls to prevent unapproved processes and apps from accessing our credential caches. You saw on the previous slide a reference to Credential. I was also looking at things like privilege deception to put fake administrative accounts out there as bait. And the idea being attacker bites on that. Well, hey, look, we've now got an alert that we can send to the SOC. There's a malicious actor in our network trying to harvest credentials because they've gone after one of our privilege laws, right? That's out there. You see the reference there to ransomware protection, because actually what the same CyberLabs team that you saw that wrote that article, done a huge amount of research and actually taking all the different strand variants of ransomware out there and testing it against the concept of implementing least privilege, application control, credential defense together. And it becomes an incredible defense to stop it from spreading and actually stop it from executing on its objective, which might be encrypting or locking out workstations. Because once you remove admin rights and you control only approved apps to the kind of sensitive areas of a workstation, it really does prevent that ransomware from doing what it wants to do, right? So it's not about preventing it getting on there. It's actually about reducing that blast radius, preventing the spread, and stopping it getting to your critical assets, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to move to next in the demo. So Aeron here, a lot more intelligent than I am, so he's going to do the dangerous job of the live demo and actually show how easy it is to remove administrative rights on the workstation. And then actually with that premise in mind, how you can start doing things like credential protection. The product that we're going to show you is a product called Endpoint Privilege Manager, that Toby mentioned before. And the way that it works is it's an agent-based solution that would sit on the workstation. It has to be an agent for what it's doing. And then it communicates with the EPM server, which is a SaaS-based application. So from an architectural standpoint, I don't have an architecture slide because it's dead straightforward, right? It's that client-server communication where it's retrieving policy information. So I'm going to hand over to Aeron, who's really going to show you how this works and looks. And I think we're going to start off, right, Aeron, by looking in the actual policy configuration of Endpoint Privilege Manager.
Yes, exactly. So thank you for that intro, David. And let me share my screen. Just let me know if you guys can see that okay.
Yeah, I can see that.
Perfect. So like David mentioned, we'll dive into those kind of three key areas. Of course, you can mostly see yourselves. There's quite a lot in the console, which I'm not going to go through. But the first kind of key point on that least privileged model is, of course, removing those admins. Now, I'm sure you will have your kind of own internal ways, internal processes that you could remove these. Obviously, EPM itself, as it's that agent-based solution, it is on the workstations. It does have the capability to do that wide-reaching removal of local admins for you. So to go through it in the sense of there is still going to be kind of break glass scenarios or maybe a account that you may still want to be a local admin, whether it's for your higher tiered support guys, so for your like tier 3 support. So even the service desk still doesn't have admin rights, but if it needs it, there are certain teams that can still have admin rights. So you can set exceptions to that. So you can put your exceptions in here. So whether it's a singular user or even an AD group, and then you deem your targets. So you can do this in a phased approach in the sense of this can go off and do remove admin rights for all your normal users in kind of phase 1. And then you can start phasing it
for your devs, for your execs, those users and those groups of users that are typically the ones that push back the most internally about losing their admin rights, you can offer a phased approach. But it's as simple as that in terms of actually going to remove those admin rights. Is as simple as turning this policy on, setting your scope, and activating it. Right, there's no complicated kind of configuration or things needed. It's very, very straightforward. But of course, with that, we need to make sure, as David mentioned, that these users can still go off and use those applications, use those system tasks, all the things that they do in their day-to-day work, but without those admin rights that they've typically always had. So with that, with EPM, we do have the ability to elevate certain applications or certain system tasks to an elevated state, as EPM is the one elevating that action, not the user's credentials or the user's permissions themselves. And again, I'm not going to go crazy in depth. Of course, if anyone wants a further deep dive demo into EPM, I'm sure we can facilitate that. But you have the capability with the policy creation to specifically target those applications or specifically target those system tasks or those system preferences that you want to allow the user to do. So I have an example of a very, very wide-reaching elevate policy, just to kind of show you exactly what you can do. So if I dive over to my VM that I have the agent deployed to already, I'm in as a standard user. So when I want to access something like date and time, which actually is admin locked, when the user does that, you can show something like a dialog box. You can make it silent if you want to, but typically you want the user to know that this thing is running in an elevated state. So the user is presented with a dialog box to say this has been launched with elevated rights for you. You can click OK, and then I can go in and I can change the date and time. It does work for applications as well. So if there's a specific application, maybe an install or something like that, you can put those rules in place to elevate that install or to elevate that application for that user who is running as a standard user. Now, alongside all of that, to also touch on the credential protection stuff as well. As an example, I will just use Chrome just because that is one of the most prevalent browsers out there. So as David kind of alluded to and mentioned in his presentation, that especially browsers themselves will keep a local store of all the credentials. And of course, with EPM, it is agent-based, so we can see everything that happens on the endpoint. We can advise the agent that, well, this is where the credential store is, and this is the only process or the only application that should ever be interacting with that credential store. So if we see anything else touching it, then we can either block or we can just detect and announce it and let people know. But for an example, with Chrome, it does have it saved locally. You can kind of see the full path here if you ever want to look yourselves. And it's under this file here for login data. I will just do it as a user, so I'll just go to edit with Notepad. But when I go to do that as a user, you can see it's just errored out for me as a user. So what EPM is doing, so I have the block on, it's saying, well, it's not this process, it's not this application that should be interacting with it, so I'm just not going to allow this to happen, right? You just can't access this at all. And then on the EPM side, for the kind of admins, they do receive a notification in the sense of a specific inbox announcement, in the sense of this attack was detected or someone has tried to steal these Chrome credentials. You get an understanding of what was used. So of course, I just did it as a user using Notepad++. Typically, you're going to see some kind of tool being used to try and harvest those credentials, but it does give you exactly what was utilized to try and access that credential store. If they did manage to get in, let's say it was in detect mode and not block mode, we can give you an understanding of, right, these are the accounts that were in that credential store. So these are the accounts that have been exposed, right? So you know yourself straight away. You can provide it to the end user if they've been saving their own kind of personal accounts within the kind of within Chrome. You can give them that list to say, look, these are all the accounts that have been exposed. You might want to go off and change your passwords for your own personal things. So yeah, so hopefully that's given you a good overview. Of course, there is a lot that I haven't dived into, as you can see yourselves, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of those kind of how it helps in those 3 key points of assisting to put you in that least privileged state, so assisting you to remove those local admins, giving those users the ability to still use certain applications and elevate certain system tasks in an admin state, so they can still do their day-to-day job but without admin rights. And then the kind of credential protection, credential items.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aeron. And so as we showed there, right, well, I guess we're biased, right, but relatively straightforward to do as well, right? But do you have any advice about how we also then implement this in a real world situation, right? So I guess the idea of agents and policies may be kind of daunting for some on the call. Any advice and suggestions that we have, based on our experience of actually making this work and getting it rolled out and implemented?
Absolutely. So what we have is, of course, with this, and you're going to remove admin rights, you're putting in almost a new way of working for the users that maybe they might not initially think that they'll be comfortable with. So when you normally maybe start talking to users about this is going to happen, you'll receive a lot of pushback. But obviously with the way that we've been doing this for quite a while now, so we do have a way of working that we call almost our quick start configuration, which is basically a way to, from the get-go, make sure that we get you in a state that we've removed those privileges, but the end users aren't really affected in any way. So with that, these are the kind of, this is our quick start config in the sense of these are the rules. So I did touch on it very, very briefly. I did open up one of these rules, one of these elevate rules, but these 5 rules from kind of day one, once you go and deploy EPM and you've removed those admin rights, these 5 rules will still put you in a state that the end users themselves won't realize, obviously if you're not involving them in the conversation, but they won't realize themselves that they do not have admin rights anymore. But you now have things like common attack vectors, your blacklisted apps that you already have as default, they're there, that baseline's there. Those things that you want to run as normal that users might typically be running at an admin level, so things like your browsers, your Office suite, your Adobe readers, things like that, well, we're forcing them to run in a normal state, so you're not exposed at that level anymore. And then the kind of last 3 rules are all around that elevation piece. But because we've done it for a while, we have kind of those kind of first 2 rules, they're going to cover most of your use cases, right? Just straight from the off. And then the final one is about just trusting sources, right? If they're a modern app and they utilize UAC, we're going to elevate it, but we're going to keep an eye on it to move it into kind of a 3 or a 4, right? So I know trying to explain this without kind of deeper diving into the product, but this is the kind of viewpoint that we have in terms of once we get you up and running, we're going to take you from that kind of 0, right, in the sense of everyone has admin rights, it's kind of free reign everywhere. Obviously that 10 being, right, everything is completely locked down, you have full control over everything, which is incredibly hard to get to. I'm sure where every security team wants to get to, but it's typically incredibly hard to do that. From day one, we can get you to that middle ground, right, of reducing that risk straight from the off, but still allowing the users to do what they do in the day-to-day working until we start getting into the nuances of how each team works.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of reflective of our general advice, right, around privileged access management. It's taking that, how can you reduce as much risk as possible with the minimal amount of, I guess, obstruction from the user side of the fence, right? So, generally on the PAM side, we talk about going after your high risk accounts like domain admins because they're high risk, but actually, low complexity to securing. And it's essentially same advice from the endpoint perspective, right? Go after that huge risk reduction by removing admin rights, but do it in a way that actually doesn't really become too obvious or noticeable to the end users. Perfect. Thank you for that, Aeron. That was great. Toby, we've kind of flown through the content a little bit, so we're way ahead of schedule, which is, I guess, unusual thing for these types of events. So I guess at this point we kind of talk about any Q&A and what the guys and girls could take as a next step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure no one on the call will mind getting some free time back today. But no, Aeron, really good demonstration there, and David, thanks for the preamble as well. I think while anyone is getting any questions that they have, any burning questions they have for the team, do use the chat box. But while we're waiting to see if anyone does have any questions there, interesting last slide. I think something we're talking about on pretty much every event we're doing at the moment is that buzzword, that buzz phrase of zero trust. And just to reiterate our thoughts on the subject, zero trust isn't a product. It's not a silver bullet that anyone can offer. It's a program. It's a mentality. It's an initiative to drive to a more secure state. And I think that last slide that you had up a moment ago really reiterates that as well, albeit it didn't explicitly mention zero trust, but that idea of getting to a firm state of least privilege takes time, right? And I think it's important for our customers, particularly when tackling any PAM project, whether it's EPM or another PAM use case, to really evaluate their own circumstances before diving into the deep end and try and tackle it all. It's very important to approach most, I would say, PAM projects with a kind of a phased approach in mind, to not get overwhelmed, but also to make the project a success, to not try and kind of bite off more than you can chew. So I suppose I'm going to throw a question out to you both around your typical approach to that scenario. How would you typically advise, how would we typically look to engage with a customer that's looking to embark on a PAM project, but perhaps doesn't quite know where to begin?
Yeah, so I could go first if you like, Aeron. You know me, I'm never shy to speak. So I would kind of repeat some of what was on that previous slide, because I think it's a great mindset to take, and actually also on the context of zero trust as well. It feeds into it, right? So one of the key things, well, certainly for me anyway, on zero trust, is that assume breach mindset. We're taking the position that actually external or internal threats are persistent on the network, altering our risk posture and putting controls in place on that assumption, right? On the assumption that actually now I'm on the network doesn't just imply that I'm good and can connect to anything. We need to revalidate. We need to establish some kind of confidence level. Things like least privilege on the workstation, application control, can actually really give you a head start, by the way, in judging the confidence level of a workstation as a point, because devices are a key role in that zero trust workflow. But more generally to your question, what we do is we take that assume breach mindset and think, well, actually, an attacker is going to go certain places. There's commonalities in types of access that they're after and accounts that they're after. As you mentioned at the very start, PAM is a very broad topic. If you think just specifically about privileged accounts, most organizations are going to have 4 to 5 times the number of privileged accounts than they do human users. And if most people think about how complex identity access management is just generally for their workforce, doubling that number or, timesing that number by 4 or 5, can obviously show that there's a lot to do there. So what you want to be doing, and certainly what we advocate, and I know obviously we work very closely with yourselves in the same messaging, right, is you want to take a kind of a risk versus complexity type approach to PAM, right? What risk am I materially reducing? What's the level of risk I'm materially reducing by securing this use case? Now, that securing the use case might be enforcing least privilege on the workstation, or removing, admin rights off servers, or securing how our domain administrators do their job. What's the risk of securing that? Because what's the implications of it being compromised and the impact it's going to have to the business versus the complexity. So it's security, right? We're implementing controls to secure that use case. Lots of vendors say out there, frictionless security. Let's be open and honest. There is no such thing. If you're implementing security, you are introducing some form of friction, right? The easiest thing to do is just open the doors and let everyone do whatever they want, right? That's frictionless. What we want to be doing is introducing less friction. But my point being with the complexity point is every use case is going to have differing complexities to achieve the objective, right? And so what you want to balance is we want to go after the high risk stuff that actually represents relatively low complexity. And Aeron showed a great example there with the local administrator rights. We can remove admin rights on the workstations very easily without impacting the users because they're part of the complexity problem. They will push back if they feel like they're being restricted in what they were doing before, right? Other complexities, of course, are going to be around the technology side of things, right? So I've rambled on a little bit there, but hopefully that gives some kind of flavors to where we feel, is a good starting position with PAM, is to make that assessment, risk versus complexity, and make sure you're getting the most kind of return on investment as part of your PAM journey.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah, no, I share those thoughts as well, for sure. Aeron, anything to add there?
I think as David always does, he's very, very poignant and always great in everything he explains. There's really not much I can go further with that really for now. Obviously, I'm more on the technical side, so if there are questions around architecture and how to implement and those kind of things, then yes, I can help. But it will be more of those deeper dive conversations that I could maybe embellish a little bit more than David has.
For sure. So I suppose just some closing thoughts for me. I'm not sure we've had any questions just yet, but look, if anyone changes their mind on that, of course, you're free to reach out to us at any time. We'd be more than happy to pick this conversation up. But just some closing thoughts for me then on the EPM scenario for sure. It can at times seem like an impossible task. There's no such thing when it comes to PAM. They can be complex projects for sure, but there is a way to achieve it for sure. And look, we can absolutely help you identify the best route for you, because it won't be necessarily the same for everyone on this call. They won't necessarily have the same path to success. But let's help you find what route is best for you. Engage with us, reach out to your account manager, email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk. There's several ways to get in touch with us, but look, we'd be more than happy to carry on this conversation. But other than that, David, Aeron, unless you've got anything else to add, thank you very much both for your time today. I think the poll is just flagged up for everyone. So if you would like to see more about EPM specifically, we can continue this conversation. But thank you very much for your time, everyone, for joining. Thanks again for our speakers, and we will speak more on this soon.
Perfect. Thanks, Toby. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.